It's an honor to be joined today by Dr. Joe Henrich. Joe is an anthropologist and chair of the Human Evolutionary Biology Department at Harvard University, where he runs the Culture, Cognition, and Coevolution Lab. Joe is also the author of The Weirdest People in the World and The Secret of Our Success. Joe, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Oh, it's nice to be with you, Adam.
To set the stage for cultural evolution, I think it would be good to talk about how, over the past 200,000 plus years, biologically, we haven't changed much. Our brains are pretty much the same. Our physiology is the same. And yet you talk about how only within the past 12,000 years or so has humanity gone through this massive change from basically hunter-gatherers to modern civilization.
The usual story about why that's the case is that environmentally, the world had been experiencing a series of ice ages. And so the last glacial maximum was about 18,000, 20,000 years ago. And then basically, since then, there was a gradual rise in temperature around the world. And then the climate stabilized sometime around 12 or 10,000 years ago. And agriculture begins in some parts of the world after that. So we're really much of what we think of as human history has been during this interglacial period, this sort of extended interglacial. And it was hard to get too much what I think of as cumulative cultural evolution. So what leads to fancy technologies and complex societies going when the environment was shifting as much as it was as we went from ice age to ice age.
Do we have any evidence before then in hunter-gatherers, for example, of something like writing or other more advanced technologies that were there maybe within single generations, but just weren't passed down to accumulate the knowledge like you're talking about?
We don't there's nothing like writing per se that appears prior to that. There's cave paintings and markings, scratches that could be some sort of numbering system. So there's a lot of possibilities like that. But there's also evidence of symbolic behavior like red ochres or seashells, beads used on necklaces and things like that. And one of the key things in the record is for a long time, it was very spotty. And when people have looked at it, they tend to want to draw a straight line and increase in complexity and assume that once humans figure out something, that's something that humans have figured out and it doesn't go away. But what I think more detailed look at the record shows is that things would flourish for a while and then there'd be a collapse and populations would actually lose valuable technologies and insights. So really you should think of the past as much more of assembling a more adaptive cultural package with fancy tools, say bow and arrows, and then a shock hits and they're lost and they disappear into history rather than one continuous line.
That even in much earlier advancements, like with fire, we use fire for maybe tens of thousands of years and then it disappears for 100,000 years and then reappears.
That's right. And of course, the story is different in different parts of the world. But fire, at least according to my colleague Richard Wrangham, probably goes back a million years or more. But then it's not central to human diets and whatnot, and humans are processing foods in other ways. Some groups appear not to have fire for long stretches. So somehow they're able to put together a decent diet and still survive. And there are human populations, everyone has fire, but there's at least evidence from some ethnography to suggest that not all populations know how to make fire. So the way populations typically deal with that is they keep a fire going. If the embers go out in your community, you can go to a nearby community and get some embers from them. Groups like the Northern Aceh, Kim reports, lost fire. In islands is a similar story. Seriono, groups like that.
You view cultural evolution as a very intentional process by humans or by other animals, or do you buy the whole mimetic evolution idea that the ideas can take on a life of their own and then natural selection might happen on them? This is the Richard Dawkins idea of memes.
I'm not sure that certainly there's intentional stuff going on. My own view is that the evidence supports the view that there's a certain degree of intentionality and people trying to do stuff better, of course. But then there's lots of stuff that evolves outside of people's conscious awareness. So I think we have evidence for both. And then I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of times what might look like a brilliant insight or a great idea needs to be seen in the context of a larger population in which lots of individuals are trying to do something consciously or unconsciously and achieve or not achieve. We tend to tell the story around the victor or the heroic inventor who invents something and not see that there's a whole bunch of near misses and other efforts nearby that make that just part of a larger population level process.
How about for theories where cultural norms get created around food or sex or something like that, and there are these evolutionary explanations that maybe it has to do with avoiding pathogens. Do you think people know that, or is it just a cultural product that happens to have some adaptive utility, and only later can we look back on that and realize that?
I definitely think that there's lots of human cultural adaptations that operate outside of our conscious awareness. So in my own work, I studied this set of Fijian food taboos that seem to protect pregnant and breastfeeding women from ciguatera, which is a toxin produced by a marine dinoflagellate, which aggregates up the food chain so that in large, especially predatory species, they tend to have large amounts of this, and it can be bad for fetuses and breastfeeding women. So these communities I studied in the South Pacific, there was all these taboos that suppressed those from the diet of women who are breastfeeding or pregnant. And I talked to lots and lots of people about that, and nobody's explained what looked to be the clear pattern that these taboos relate to protecting women from ciguatera. And anthropologists have pointed to lots of other stuff. Famously, Peter Brown documents that people in Sardinia would move around such that they avoided wherever the malaria mosquitoes were, and they had practices like keeping their windows shut at night so as to keep the evil spirits out. But actually, it all looked like practices built around avoiding mosquitoes, essentially, and avoiding malaria. And I can reel off more and more examples where it's clear the people were doing something adaptive and they didn't understand why they were doing it.
It
I'll give you
sounds like
another
Go ahead.
example is circumcision. So circumcision pops up in all kinds of places, especially in Africa. And it seems to be highly protective against both getting and transmitting certain viruses like HIV and other kinds of STIs. But the people themselves don't mention STIs when they talk about cutting the tips of their sons' penises off, which is intuitively for many, seems like an odd thing to do.
So this is an example where religious beliefs or even practices can evolve, and they're adaptive even if people don't know that's what the religious belief is actually doing.
Yeah. And the rituals themselves are an interesting case because there's now a large body of psychological evidence showing that communal rituals will often build solidarity amongst a group of people. But you can look at lots of groups where that seems to be working great, but they do the ritual to satisfy the god or for some other religious reason, not because it builds stronger emotional bonds among the people in the ritual.
Do you see any proto rituals like that in our primate relatives?
I don't. And I think that would be unlikely just because there's not enough cultural transmission in other species to have that. But in principle, it would be interesting to know about cases where that's a possibility.
You write a lot about religion leading to some of the cultural transformations that you wouldn't really obviously connect. So, for example, you talk about Protestant work ethic and you talk about how the rise of Christianity led to more of a focus on this nuclear family that made us gradually less collectivist and more individualistic in the West.
And so that's a case where lots of different religions have adopted practices that affect the structure of the family. So you have religions like Zoroastrianism, which celebrated marriage and mating among close relatives. At the elite level, there was even had brother sister marriage, and then among lots of the population, you had intensive cousin marriage. So this is going on in Persia before Islam, and then you have Islam, which has things like inheritance rules. Daughters have to inherit half of what sons inherit, which is arguably among anthropologists part of what gives rise to parallel cousin marriage. So Islamic societies are almost unique in the world in having preferential marriage for your father's brother's daughter, for example, if you're male. So that's affecting the sort of social wiring between families. And then in one branch of Christianity, there was a growing push against cousin marriage, and it was thought of as incest and disgusting and a concern with lots of public health related things. So bad things would happen in places because God was angry because people were marrying their cousins, for example. And this then alters the structure of families in the places that adopted this particular brand of Christianity. Other brands of Christianity kept marrying their cousins for 1,000 years. So this is not peculiar to Christianity. It's this one brand.
That's an interesting example of culture genetic interaction because you could think that after many generations of that, the more inbreeding there is, I guess the worse your genes are going to get. You start getting increased rates of mutations and other bad stuff.
Yeah, that's true if you have enough first cousin marriage. A lot of populations have some degree of cousin marriage. And as long as you intermix enough non cousin marriage with it, or second cousin marriage or third cousin marriage, you can avoid a lot of the bigger part of the genetic downside. The other thing, though, I don't think that this case is very focused on the genes. If it is, it's not very surgical, because along with these prohibitions against marrying your genetic cousins, it's also all kinds of affinal relatives. So people you would be related to through your spouse. So, for example, many societies, if your wife died, you would marry her sister. So it's called, there's levirate and sororal marriage. If your husband died, you would marry his brother. That's famously in the Bible. But this one branch of Christianity put an end to that. In fact, it was one of the first things they put an end to. And that's not inhibiting marriage to relatives, but it is preventing certain kinds of social ties from being formed and forcing people to reach out and build broader social ties. So the impacts of this are much bigger on the social network than it would be on the sort of inbreeding concerns.
What happened psychologically in the last 4,000 years or so that led to monotheistic religions becoming dominant?
So I think where you're going here is I have working with R. Norn Zion, Ted Slingerland, and some other scholars have tried to understand the spread of these big moralizing religions. So think of our major world religions today, and they have a kind of universalizing morality. They often have some punishment for proper behavior in life that goes on. And we're trying to understand why that emerges. And what makes this more of a puzzle is that if you look at the religions of small scale societies, the gods are often smaller, weaker, and more whimsical. They have a moral sort of bias, but it's a moral bias in the same way people have a moral bias. They're morally flawed, but they tend to be concerned about morality. So we wondered, for example, how gods went from being relatively small scale, concerned with what's going on in the clan, to being these big gods that are concerned with everybody, universalistic, can read people's minds, have the power to punish, power of life and death, afterlife, and things like that. And so we argued that it was competition among groups that drove the expansion of these gods as they grew over time and eventually led them to be concerned about things that would affect the likelihood of society succeeding in competition against other societies. Honesty towards strangers, keep maintaining harmony within communities, those kinds of things. And and then we conducted a bunch of research around the world to try to show, to see if there was evidence for that. And used a variety of lines of evidence suggest that when people believe in a more powerful moralizing God, they're more likely to be pro-social towards co-religionists. So these are strangers they don't know, won't see again, no chance of future interactions, but share the same believe in the same gods as they do.
What do you make of the psychoanalytical idea that what people were doing when they had all of these smaller different gods, and you'd have a god of rage, a god of lust, that they were representing something like internal drives or emotions and personifying them as these gods and using it to essentially explain their psychology?
Oh, that's interesting. No, so I actually haven't seen any evidence on that. Offhand, it sounds loony, but I would be
I
persuaded.
thinking of people like Carl Jung and even maybe Freud, so this is there wouldn't really be evidence, but I think it's an interesting theory. So I guess the idea is that again, you have this personification, and then when you hear language like people were possessed by Ares, possessed by the spirit of rage, maybe that's not so different than when we talk about in court, you can get temporary insanity if you say the context was such that a reasonable person might be blinded by anger and do something they otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah, I mean, I just haven't seen it doesn't fit with the what I've read about small gods, but
And then what about for as you move towards this monotheistic God that's something like
well,
the
I just let me just stop you there. So there's nothing about monotheism in this theory. For some reason, so you're not the first person to ask me about the monotheism part, but one thing we're super clear about is that the theory doesn't say anything about monotheism per se. You can like Christianity has multiple gods, right? There's Mary and there's these saints, and they all seem to have some sort of power. Maybe they're
Mhm.
lobbyists, but
I guess I was thinking specifically about, let's say, God the Father in the Abrahamic religions, that this Father might be something like a personification of the watchful eye. So as you mentioned, it in these moralizing societies, once you move towards this more objective morality that's supposed to apply not only to your immediate kin group, but like to any stranger you interact with, that you the religion starts to develop as a personification of that social awareness.
yeah, I think the key question is because you have lots of groups that have ancestor gods, and there the gods might punish and take action, but they're only concerned with proper treatment among members of the same clan. You might have the same thing at the level of a group of clans where there's some sort of tribal deity. So at some point, you had to have the transition to all of humanity is within the scope there. And then you're policing all kinds of social interactions. So it's got to scale up people's notions of the community. It definitely has the sense of the community is watched. So the idea is that social norms are built on other people tending to your behavior, making judgments about your behavior. So all of us are under the surveillance of the community. So the religious trick was just to make a God a kind of part of that. And then gradually he or she became imbued with more and more powers to do the kinds of punishment that the community might do through their monitoring and reputational damage and stuff. So it's augmenting the systems and communities that already exist is the idea.
There's this Arabic phrase that goes something like, me against my brother and I against our cousin, my cousin and I against the stranger. So it's like this expanding circle of care. And one theory I've heard is that once you get a universalist religion that says something like that, it expands your circle of care. Or another way of thinking about that could be like Independence Day scenario, where imagine if there were aliens that came down and we were at war with them. I feel like that would bond humanity much more. It would make you think, forget our petty human squabbles. We're all human and they're not.
Yeah, I think that intuition is very consistent with this idea of the role of intergroup competition. One of the important ideas that gets missed with those is that in order to maintain cooperation in a large group, it can be damaging to that to have high levels of cooperation within the group. If you can imagine, if you go to court and there's a court case and you can either lie and protect one of your cousins or tell the truth and make the whole justice system work a little bit better. A lot of the question is, are you going to lie to protect your cousin? And of course, societies vary in how well they would do this. Ones that have very tight family bonds, it might be completely expected and there might be a lot of pressure on a person to lie to protect their cousin in court. In other places like Canada, for example, people will lie and will not lie, and then the court system works a little bit better. So in some sense, there's a tension between small group cooperation and large group cooperation.
I've heard you mention that many times, and maybe I'm just so in the weird bubble, the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic bubble, that I just can't fathom the idea of breaking that law, which is something that it seems like is supposed to be for the good of all of us. It seems selfish, but then I know that within this framework, that's just me being overly individualistic or selfish or not as collectivist.
Yeah. And I've definitely talked to people in different parts of the world that have exactly the opposite reaction that you're having. They're like, you mean there are people who wouldn't help their friend or cousin and they would actually tell those strangers the truth? Who cares about those strangers? What about, I'm concerned about my own, that kind of thing.
You mentioned off camera that more recently your lab is doing historical text analysis to look at some of these cultural and psychological changes. Before we talk about the research you're actually doing, I want to ask if you've heard about this theory. I think the last name of the person was Julian, and it was an old psychologist, maybe 1800s. And he had this theory that maybe 2000 years ago ish, around the same time that these great works like the Odyssey were being written, that there was some cultural or psychological transformation. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think it's Julian James, and he wrote a book called The Bicameral Mind.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. And this is the question of whether people were conscious in the same sense that modern people are conscious, right? Could self-reflect in the same way. Is that where you're?
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in that. We find lots of variation around the world in the use of mentalizing and mental states. It's worth noting that weird people are particularly obsessed with mental states. One of the things that we're going to do with the Latin texts and that some of my colleagues and former students, so I have a current student named TC Jeng and Manvir Singh, have put together a database of folk tales. And working with some collaborators, they've been analyzing those folk tales for the use of mental state terms. And they find a giant difference between sort of non-Western folk tales, which very rarely make reference to mental states, and Western folk tales, which are really obsessed sometimes with mental states. And there's a fair amount of historical scholarship suggesting that pre-Christian Europe made few references to mental states, and then it gets more and more mental state oriented. I pointed out in my book, The Weirdest People in the World, that in Western law is extremely obsessed with mental states. So this idea of the bicameral mind makes some sense to me. The tricky part is to figure out whether it was just a way of talking that it could be, so for example, some societies where I work in Fiji, it's impolite to refer to mental states because you're talking about something that you don't know about. So you can talk about your own mental state, but you can't talk about other people's mental state because you're making guesswork and inferences, which is in contrast to the West, where, we'll send people to jail on the basis of people's judgment about what their mental state was when they did something. And everything turns on whether they did it on purpose or did it by accident or the details of their mental state. So there's this big, interesting divide there.
This seems related to the divide between guilt and shame that you talk about, where in Western societies, it's more coming from the individual. Like you feel guilty and that guilt keeps you in check. Whereas shame, it's more based on others projecting it onto you.
Yeah, you're concerned about what other people will think of you. And that creates a withdrawal, and you're basically asking for forgiveness from the community. That's what the shame display is. It seems to be a human universal. And guilt, people often think of it as a social thing because some of the reasons you might fall below your own standards those standards might be shared by everybody. So it's both guilt and shame at the same time. But you can also feel guilty for not achieving something that you personally wanted to achieve, but nobody else really expects you to achieve that. But you feel bad because you didn't go to the gym every day or you didn't do whatever that big thing, you didn't get a score on some test that you wanted to get. And so you feel guilt. Yeah, so there's this difference across societies, which is quite striking. You can get it from you can look at internet searches, you can look at people's reports of descriptions of how they felt in different contexts. Anthropologists have long documented this, just a real emphasis on guilt in Western societies and a real emphasis on shame with very little guilt in many other societies.
These text analyses you're mentioning, you talked about the using mentalizing words, and both guilt and shame are mentalizing. But do you see a further breakdown between sorts of emotions that are more individual focused versus that have this social aspect?
I don't have an answer for you yet. We don't have enough results. We're still figuring out the best ways to do it and the best ways to deal with changes in the meanings of words over time, different genres of texts. But that's where we want to get to.
This kind of relates to this, again, a psychoanalytical idea of archetypes. So people like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, and maybe it connects to the Dawkins mimetic evolution as well. So I guess the idea would be there's some spirit of behaviors or something like almost like natural laws, if you believe in something like moral laws being something you can measure objectively in a game theory way. Do you think that's plausible? That there's something like, as you look at either behavior or moral laws over time cross culturally, that to the extent patterns between them, it would be tapping into something like a natural law that
No. My view is that there's lots of patterns across societies in the nature of cooperation and moral judgment, but that arises from a combination of two factors. One is that humans share a human nature. So across society, that places boundaries and constraints and fills in some of the content of different moral systems. And two, there are cultural evolutionary processes which can only work in some fixed number of ways. So that's going to help create cultural patterns across societies. So just to make an obvious point, there are lots of human universals which are purely the products of cultural evolution. You mentioned one, fire. So every society has fire, but everybody has to learn how to make fire. It's easy to imagine a society without fire. It's just that they tend to go extinct, but it's purely culturally transmitted. Although fire is an interesting case because it has also shaped our physiology. But but
oh,
that's
that's because
you can
once we
have
start
morality.
cooking,
In order to survive, you have to be able to cooperate to some minimum degree, and there's only so many ways to get humans to cooperate. So something like rituals. Almost every society has collective rituals. There's maybe a couple of asterisk type exceptions, but that's culturally evolved, right? There's nothing that if we took a bunch of people and put them on an island, it's not clear that they'd come up with rituals in the first generation.
when I was pointing to natural law, I wasn't trying to be like morality. I was thinking about things in evolutionary game theory, like tit for tat, where you get an emergent strategy that turns out to maybe be mathematically optimal, or something like population dynamics, like maybe in terms of what a stable rate of reproduction. So there would be something like, I don't know, latent information in the behavior. And then if you analyze it, you can extract something.
I see. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing I meant when cultural evolution has certain rails or guides or tracks or something that mean that not everything's equally likely.
Do you see this across species as well?
I mean, there are definitely culture in other species, and things like whale song and bird song definitely evolve. Chimps definitely have traditions that are local and possibly adaptive. But there's not a lot of cumulative cultural evolution, and I haven't seen good evidence of anything that looks like a culturally evolved moral system. Although there are maybe some like coordination things, symbols mean different things, or actions mean different things and across different chimp groups. So maybe you can squint a little bit. But beyond that, I see much that's compared.
Another big nature and nurture discussion at the intersection between our two research areas is that of sex and gender differences. So clearly, there are many facets of gender differences that are purely socially constructed, and then there are some that are biological. And what what's the intersection between those two? Are there any forms of universal sex differences that aren't actually biological that are cultural?
That's an interesting question. So first, I want to backtrack a little bit. And so one of the things that I have been trying to persuade people of since the secret of our success is that it's all biology. It's just a question of whether it's genetic evolution or cultural evolution. But cultural evolution is a kind of biological evolution. Now, of course, that runs against many people's mental categories. But I think it does because people are dualists, right? And they have there's the sort of animal biological stuff on the one hand, and then there's the kind of woozy cultural mind stuff on the other hand. But that's not actually how I think the world is. And we have lots of good cases where we know culture changes our biology. So, for example, when you learn to read, which is relatively new in human evolutionary history, it thickens your corpus callosum and makes specialized circuitry in your left ventral hemisphere. Those are biological changes. There was surely a time as literacy spread across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries when corpus callosi were thickening
Mhm.
as an increasing rate of thick corpus callosi across populations, as reading spread and people began to learn as children and whatnot. So culture is a kind of biological evolution. It's just not a kind of genetic evolution. When we learn something, you're the expert here, but it appears in our brain, right? It's some kind of changes in our brains that allow us to speak a new language or juggle or drive through London in a taxi cab and find our way on the maps or whatever. So these are cases where we know there's brain changes when we learn. So culture's learning, so it changes our brains, it changes the organic substrate for which that we think with. Does that make sense to you?
Yes. Although I guess sometimes you see something that originates as a cultural change, and then you get this sort of Baldwin effect where eventually it becomes genetically
Right.
inscribed over time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So there's the kind of change in the biology that I talked about, which I make explicitly non-genetic. But then the other piece of that, and this is what the secret of our success is mostly about, is that in humans operating over really long time periods, a lot of our genetic evolution has been driven by our cultural evolution. So I gave the example of fire, which is clearly culturally learned and culturally transmitted, but it's altered the genes which shape our colons and our teeth and our digestive tract, because essentially cooking is it's digestion outside the body. So it's doing the job that's normally done in other species outside the body. So it changes our genome. And that's one of the reasons why you have to think of these together. Now, getting back to the sex difference question, when I teach about this, one of the first things I point out are some of the parallels in sex differences between humans and non human species. Male inclination towards violence or something is something that we've seen across every human society. It's never that females are more violent than males, at least not in any data I've ever seen. It varies. The magnitude varies a lot. So there's lots of flexibility there. So that's
Mm.
an interesting sex difference.
Yeah, there's a massive body of research, both in humans and other animals, connecting that increase in aggression to testosterone levels. Although interestingly, it's not just a measure of individual difference, like you have 20% more testosterone, therefore you're 20% more aggressive. If you in rodent studies where they're doing these experimental manipulations, pumping them with basically like anabolic steroid levels, like 5 times the rate of normal. Or in humans, people who are taking steroids, then you see some measurable differences. But most of the time, it's permissive. And Robert Sapolsky's done interesting research connecting this to social hierarchy. So the idea is if you pump, he did this in baboons, if you pump, let's say, mid-ranking baboons full of way more testosterone than normal, they do indeed become more aggressive, but only still towards subordinates. They don't the aggression doesn't make them confident enough to suddenly try and topple the alpha chimp, the alpha baboon.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, and one of my favorite kind of cultural sex gender conundrums, sex role conundrums is this the gender paradox, where if you look at personality or moral differences between self-identified males and females across societies with the greatest gender equality indexes have the biggest differences in personality and morality when you compare the males and females across populations. So that's interesting.
They've heard about this in the sense that maybe the more egalitarian the society is, the more room there is for any biological differences to take full form. And that part makes sense to me. Although the inverse of that hasn't made sense to me because I would think that a more gender unequal society would be the one reinforcing those stereotypes, or because it seems to make sense if it was a gender unequal society in the sense that everyone was forced to do the same job and didn't have the same freedom. So maybe freedom of choice is where you would see some more magnified sex differences in who's doing what job. But often in the most patriarchal societies, it doesn't seem like women are forced to work, but not allowed to choose. It seems more like they're not even allowed to work.
Yeah, but they can self-select into a preferred occupation. Could have to do with the ability to self-select into your preferred social niche. And that in the unequal societies, although there's rigorous difference, there isn't any self-selection. You're just in whatever one you're assigned to. But I share there is a kind of messiness there that doesn't quite fit.
Franz de Waal, a famous primatologist, has done some research on this. And even in play preferences, like with toys, you see pretty similar sex differences that you'd find in humans in other primates. For example, female chimps are more interested in playing with dolls. And if you give a male young chimp a doll, he'll just rip it to shreds or try and do something else. Or in terms of who they're observing, males like to follow the other males around and watch them hunt and learn hunting from a much earlier age. And females will watch the older female's mother and they'll play mother with the doll. And even that, it's very hard to determine whether that's a biological or cultural effect because clearly they're already learning from their parents.
Wait, so you're saying in chimps, they're already learning from their parents?
Because some people, let's say on the extreme nature stance, would say these sex differences that you see are instinctual. So instinctually, the young females know that they want to play mother more than they want to hunt. But you could also say the only reason that's happening is because they're observing people of the same other chimps of the same sex from a very young age. So it's like cultural learning.
Have people made that argument about chimps? That's interesting.
So Franz de Waal has this book called Different: Gender Through the Eyes of a Primatologist. And I guess there's three arguments being made. One is that the types of gender differences that exist in humans that either haven't always existed historically or don't exist across cultures, or that you couldn't see any analog of in other species, those we can be confident are just socially constructed. And then there's another type where it's primarily socialized. So you would say this is still more of a gender effect than an effect of sex. And you observe it across species. So this would be like the females would rather play with dolls than males. But you can't really attribute a biological cause to that unless you want to say there's something like an innate mothering instinct that somehow kicks in. But it seems like he was more comfortable there, arguing that this is social learning. And it just happens to be the case that the females learn from the older females in the troop and the males learn from the older males. And then the other types of sex differences that he calls sex differences are those where you can directly attribute a biological cause, like the testosterone levels, for example.
You still have to have that rule, though, that has to be innate, that you preferentially learn from those who you've decided match you on sex.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I wonder if it's the preferential learning of the baby, or if it's just like the adults are naturally gravitating towards the same sex ones and they like have this sort of sex stratification from a young age.
Yeah, in the case of chimps, and I can ask my chimp expert friends, but that kind of makes sense for the females, but dad's not very involved. It's not even clear if they'll know who dad is.
Uh-huh.
So both females and males are going to have a lot of access to mom, and mom's going to probably spend a lot of time taking care of infants. But dad's not really, he's just one of the other male chimps in there. So the
Right.
male, very asymmetrical situation, because if they want to learn from another male, they just got to go out into the world and interact with these other males.
Mhm.
Now, dad might be one of the males that tends to hang around mom, so there might be a little bit of preferential access to dad. But certainly lots of other males are going to try that too. Yeah, and then the female child is going to have a lot of access to.
That's a good pivot back to humans. So male chimps don't really do any parenting at all. They father the offspring with their sperm and then they just do their own thing. And then human males, I think, father more than almost any other species. And you talk about parental investment and cross-cultural differences in that, as well as differences in pair bonding and monogamy versus polygyny and stuff like that.
There's definitely fathers are important in lots of human societies. Definitely less important than mom. And but the amount of fathering depends a lot on the marriage and mating system. So if you have a polygynous society, most women still end up with mates in those situations, but you have a disproportionate share of elite males getting more of the females. And that just means that as a matter of principle, there might be more resources to go around, but there's less actual fathering input in terms of the male just only has so much time to put into the children of several different mates. So in a monogamous society, it's just a one-to-one pairing. So there's a lot more, and in some ways you can think about it as in a monogamous society, there's more males being enlisted into the ranks of fathers and husbands than there are in polygynous society. So there's just more individuals to do fathering in a monogamous situation. And then I've talked a lot about the social dynamics of.
When you say elite males here, do you mean it more in the sense of genetic fitness, like the evolutionary biologists talk about it, or do you mean more status? I know they're very correlated.
They end up getting pretty correlated for much of human history. I've spent time looking at this question in hunter-gatherer societies, and there you don't get huge polygyny, but most men are just monogamous. But there's some fraction of the best hunters, warriors, shamans, storytellers that end up with more than one wife at the same time. And the number what might be like 3 to 5. You don't get these kind of big numbers. Of course, when you get true elites, elite classes, you end up with harems and all kinds of things like that. But yeah, and this, as best we can tell, converts into genetic fitness.
I've heard of some hunter-gatherer societies that actually shame the best hunter in the group as a way of humbling them or avoiding too much power or status being accumulated at the top, so there's not too much inequality to destabilize things.
Yeah. So there are lots of rules about food sharing of meat that mean that the material resources that any hunter brings back, he loses control of them in various ways. And famously, the Chungwasi and the Kalahari, when a hunter brings back a particularly good animal, people will engage in insulting the meat. So they'll say that this is a crappy animal and doesn't have much fat and it's not going to be good to eat. When actually everybody's delighted and it's going to be awesome. But they're just trying to, the way they describe it is cooling his heart, making him tame. And then also there are these rules. So he loses control of the meat completely and it's divided up. It depends on the society, but basically it's out of his hands and it gets divided up.
Does
So
it actually
he
have
get
any
it. He gets some status credit, but his tendency to boast and put himself above the others is suppressed by these egalitarian norms. And he doesn't have control. Like you could imagine if he owned it, if norms said he owned it, he could be doling it out in order to get alliance partners and influence, get extra wives and things like that. But this tamps down his ability to exploit that.
So I guess that's separate from other types of cultures, which would just give you status for being more generous.
Yeah. So there's lots of societies where you control your resources, but then you throw big parties essentially, and you basically give away all your stuff by having the party. These are big man societies, and their generosity is a source of status. Being able to give away a lot is a source of status. You exploit other people basically by giving them free stuff.
You mentioned earlier, in addition to the type of status that you can get from more fitness markers, that could also be from something like storytelling ability or perhaps creativity. And Jeffrey Miller has written about this in his book, The Mating Mind. He has a theory that one of the reasons for our intelligence and our creativity could have been this runaway sexual selection, that more intelligent, more creative partners are more attractive, and that maybe that exerted a bigger selection pressure than actually needing to survive because our chimp ancestors with much lower intelligence seem to have done just fine surviving. So maybe it was more of a sexual selection than natural selection thing.
Yeah, I just don't see that cashing out in the kind of effects on brain sizes and cognitive abilities. So in lots of
Mhm.
species, you can get really dramatic in differences in body size and brain size. And humans have some body size difference, but it doesn't look like something that had a big sexual runaway process where the massive size of the human brain could be explained by that kind of process. Instead, the cross-cultural or the cross-species data looks like it's consistent with this cultural brain hypothesis, which is that our brains expanded in order to be able to acquire the ideas, beliefs, and values of information stored in other people's heads. And that's important for both sexes and would have driven up the joint expansion in male and female sizes, whereas you would have seen this much larger dichotomy in brain sizes if Jeff's proposal was true.
I've read about rates of polygamy or something like sex ratio being predictive of violence rates across cultures.
Yeah, the evidence is a little bit mixed, and you definitely see it in some places. I think a lot depends on the details. And so, one of the cases I've argued is that if the sex ratio are low status, unmarriageable men, then you can have a situation where they engage in crime and take risks and stuff because they're trying to get into the marriage and mating market. So, for example, in China, when the Chinese government imposed the one child policy, it actually happened in different provinces at different times. And the imposition of that policy, combined with a preference for male babies, led to a situation in which you were producing many more male children than female children. And some provinces started doing this early and some started doing it later. So then you can do an analysis that looks at crime rates 18 years after the policies imposed, and that you have extra males as predicted. And a lot of those males aren't going to get mates because there's too many males. And then that seems to predict the higher rates of crime, which then begin rising throughout the 1990s in China. And seems to be explainable
It's
by
it's interesting that with way more women, just see increasing rates of polygyny. And if anything, the men are probably happy to have multiple women all to themselves. But then if the opposite happens, it doesn't seem like societies ever settle into a place where one woman has multiple husbands. It's just that violence increases and competition between the men increases.
That's right, and that's why sex differences are important to attend to. Because if you create a low status pool of males, they just get very unhappy and start causing problems. If you create a big pool of females, you don't have any increased crime rates or violence rates or anything like that. It's asymmetrical.
Are there any societies where you over time see consistent rates of either having many more women or many more men?
You definitely get situations where you have more women because men get themselves killed more frequently. And so if you have a lot of violent conflict with other groups, you start to run low on the men and you have more women.
You see this in modern dating apps as well. Like all of the data from there completely matches what you would predict either anthropologically or even looking at cross species models. So there's many more men on dating apps. There seems to be much more competition, which you can measure in the sense of who's getting all the likes. Like women on average get much more likes than men. The likes are Pareto distributed, same income inequality distributed, where like top 10% of users get 90% of the likes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so there was this my colleague Martin Serbeck studies bonobos. And bonobos are the cousin species to chimpanzees, equally related to humans. And they have a lot of differences from chimpanzees which are important. And the females form coalitions and they suppress male dominance and all this kind of stuff. So I think that people thought that maybe when the females are making the male choice, it'll be all like even and equal, and everybody will get the same number of matings because they're the free sex hippie species. But it turns out their reproductive skew looks just like the chimps, except they're not doing violence. It's just that the females all prefer the same males, which is like the dating apps, right? You just recreate the same situation. And it's actually, I think, going to be a growing social problem. So there's two factors. There's the dating apps, but they're actually a little bit of a latecomer to the story. The other thing that's going on in contemporary societies is that women entered the labor market. So this started in the 1970s, right? And so increasingly women have been doing better and better economically over the last 30 years or so. So now there's a lot of women who have a choice between some lower status guy who they're not that attracted to or nothing. They have the economic wherewithal to choose nothing. And so then you're getting this pool of low status men who can't get into the marriage and mating market. which is reflected in the dating apps because nobody's interested in the sort of bottom part of the pool. And then you're creating this pool of low status men, which is going to get worse and worse. And I think this may be related to this incel phenomenon, which is being linked to violent crime and mass murder and awful things like that. So,
Is it just the low status itself, or let's say low economic opportunity, or is it specifically when there's higher rates of inequality? So is it absolute versus relative deprivation that matters more?
assuming pair bonding, which could be a big assumption in this case, but I mean, it's a status game, so it's a zero sum game. So it's all relative. But I think the big thing is that the theory is that males react very negatively to being left out of the marriage and mating market. So being an evolutionary zero. So being able to get one mate and have a child means you have a stake in the future, you're a father, you're a dad, and your testosterone drops, at least in monogamous societies. Whereas if you're not in that category, then, you're trying to get into that mating and marriage market. I think it's not a continuum. There's a little bit of a step function there.
So the sexual marketplace is uniquely zero-sum game because people are just taken as partners or not. But you also write about cultural differences between people who tend to view economics or the world at large as more zero-sum versus positive sum.
Yeah, so there's lots of variation across societies. And like I said, there's almost always a zero sum game in the sort of sexual marketplace. In principle, you could imagine the world where everybody's having sex with everybody else and there's kind of total fluidity.
Like the
But
bonobos.
yeah, it turns out not like the bonobos, like the imagined bonobos. The bonobos turn out they're not like that. It's just female choice is creating massive asymmetry. Funny. So there's the imagined bonobo. And yeah, so you have that. But then there's lots of other features of economic life which are non-zero sum. But societies have varied over time in how non-zero sum those games were. One example would be land. If a society has a fixed amount of land, then it's zero sum. If I have more land, you have less land. And so then we're playing a zero sum game, assuming that's the main source of wealth and productivity, which it was during lots of our agricultural period. Once you have cities, trade, rapid innovation and stuff, then the land seems almost unimportant because all the action is in the non-zero sum effects of technology and trade and things like that. So I think populations in the world today, depending on their history, have more and less zero sum inclinations because of whatever dominated their economic system. And you can get stuck. We think we can get stuck in these. This is a theoretical work with John Paul Caravello, Nathan Nunn, and some other economists. There can be traps where you'll still think the world's zero sum, even though the world's changed. You're using cultural beliefs and values and ways of looking at things that come from a former era via cultural inheritance. And so then the trick is to figure out how to escape that and get the perception of your world as it actually is now.
I've heard an argument by Malcolm Gladwell that one of the cultural differences between Asian countries and Western countries is that even if the amount of land is fixed, the different farming techniques, like let's say between rice and wheat, I don't remember the details, but it was something like the way that you farm rice, there's more of a direct relationship between how much effort you put into it and how much food output you get. Whereas he was saying that wheat, which was more of the Western crop yield, is just like you plant it and then you roll the dice and see what happens. And he was arguing that to the extent that the stereotype is true, that you see Asian countries as valuing hard work more, that this could be a cultural origin of that.
Hmm. Interesting. So there's a lot of cool work looking at the effects of paddy rice versus wheat. So I'm thinking here of the work of the social psychologist Thomas Talhelm. And Thomas, in a variety of projects, has collected data all around China and as well as some in India. And what he did is he looked at the counties in different Chinese provinces and looked to see what percentage of their cropland is devoted to rice versus wheat. And he finds lots of interesting differences. So there's an association between collectivistic thinking, nepotism, and more paddy rice agriculture. And the question is why? And it could have to do with the labor demands of rice and the fact that clans formed in the rice areas, and clans tend to be associated with this particular kind of thinking. I haven't actually seen data making the link that you're suggesting, although that sounds totally plausible. I'd love to see some data.
I think he might have been citing some of that research that you just mentioned.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. How about changes in diet across cultures or across history since industrialization. I know of some impacts on my research, like on pubertal timing, for example. This is both good and bad, and you see this across animals too. As the number of calories you intake goes up, the earlier your body is ready for puberty because it's okay, I'm in a resource rich environment. Like I don't have to only be in bare minimum survival mode. I can get to reproduction faster. And then I imagine that there are cultural changes that happen with and psychological changes that happen that co-occur with that.
They co-occur with increasing calories.
Yeah, calories, or maybe it would be indirectly through this something like earlier reproduction or earlier puberty. Like I'm imagining a whole bunch of different angles we could take on it.
Yeah, yeah, nothing's coming to mind other than I know that people do adapt their effort to the amount of calories they have. If
Mhm.
people are getting fewer calories, they just don't work as hard as sort of non-humans as a way of compensating. So Nathan Nunn has this famous paper on the arrival of the potato in Europe. So the potato is a New World crop that the Europeans discover and they bring it back and it becomes a staple for lots of European cities. And he shows the big increase in productivity that occurs in Europe when they can add the potato to their repertoire of crops they can rely on because the potato is super productive.
I guess another example that would be uniquely weird is differences in attraction. So in the past, being overweight might signal high status, and now it's the opposite.
Yeah, so there's some great I'm really interested in the human nature stuff. So I'm always looking for cases where something seems to really violate expectations on that. And one is some of this stuff having to do with weight preferences and skin color, where in some societies being really big and heavy is super attractive. And in other societies it's being quite skinny. In some societies having darkening your skin is the thing to do. Like Americans in the 1970s would go sunbathe with oil on their skin to try to make it as brown as possible. But then in other places, you got to lighten your skin, and there's treatments and chemicals and all kinds of stuff people will put on their skin to make it lighter. Culture is quite powerful. There's interesting research to be done on preferences for cosmetic surgery, which seems to vary across societies in interesting ways.
Do you think it's related to handicapping? Like whatever the thing that's hardest to get is the thing that becomes most desirable?
Yeah, I think that's going to explain some of the variation. And a lot of it is just things the elite end up doing. Everybody wants to be like the elite. There's a couple interesting cases of this. One is the powdered wigs that men started wearing in the 17th and 18th century that became so popular in Europe. And I think it started with an English or a French king who had a hair problem. And so he started wearing these wigs, and then everybody wanted to wear the wigs, and then it became the thing to do.
That's interesting. So another subject on the demographic changes that we're talking about is I do you know Jonathan Haidt's work on the idea that of helicopter parenting and coddling this
Sure.
younger generation? So one argument is that it's an indirect result of demographic changes that people are having fewer children and having children at an older age. So the idea is that if you're having like 5 kids in your 20s as opposed to 1 kid in your 30s, just the amount of time and resources you have is going to be so massively different. And then even if you're not intending, I'm going to overprotect them, it could just be if that's all where all your attention is going, it just happens.
Yeah. I agree with those observations, and I take it that you're suggesting that part of what's going on is that maybe people wanted to be overprotective, but they couldn't because, as a practical matter, they lacked the expertise, they lacked the money, and taking care of all those kids was just too time consuming, essentially. Is that the idea?
Right.
Or?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's probably also a prestige effect that's similar in the sense that it's long been the case, 1870 or so, that wealthier people had fewer children, more educated people had fewer children. So they're gonna do more of this, and so then they become the models for younger people.
Is that a uniquely weird effect? Because I would think that in hunter gatherers, maybe the highest status men would be the one having the most children and getting
Yeah.
multiple wives.
Yeah, I don't think you get that effect until you have mostly people not engaging in farming and meritocratic institutions. Because with farm, more kids is more farm labor. And in lots of societies, more kids is a bigger kin group, and that's the source of all your power. So the family base, the kinship institutions have to be relatively unimportant to get a demographic transition of that kind. But this is a huge debate, right? Just
Yeah.
trying.
Another weird effect connecting to my research on brain development is this idea of the adversity exposed brain. This was a recent paper by, I think, Dorsa Amir and Bruce Ellis. And the basic idea is that we have this idea of what a typical brain looks like, but it's mostly based on weird samples. And then there's a bunch of interesting research looking at early life adversity and how the brain changes. But this paper was arguing that the adversity exposed brain is probably more like what a normal human brain has looked like throughout
Right,
history, and that
right.
we're observing something like a really sheltered, cushy brain.
Yeah, I like Dorsey's angle on that. That's nice. What were some of the key differences? What were the differences between aversity and non-averse brains?
Often they're framing it in terms of life history theory. If you're talking about that cross species, then you have two absolute extremes of insects or fish, which lay thousands of eggs and most of the eggs die. And then you have mammals like humans and elephants that have like typically one child at a time, but lots of investment goes into them and they're most likely to survive. And then within humans, you see similarly, like the more sheltered, or I guess the more weird you grow up in, the more secure your environment is, the more you tend to take this slow life strategy. So they're better at delay of gratification. That's some of Dorse's work. Mo- Less stress, and stress hormones make you age faster, which is related to the puberty stuff we were talking about earlier. Like, not good in the sense that you're not going to live as long, but good in this evolutionary sense that you're probably going to mature faster and then have babies faster. So, framing it in terms of life history theory, basically, children who are more adversity exposed tend to be l- worse at delayed gratification. But then, of course, that means if you're in an insecure environment, it means better at taking advantage of opportunities that are right here, right in front of you. They tend to hit puberty earlier, again, because of the stress hormones. They tend to have kids earlier. And, this gets into socioeconomic effects of like they're more likely to be single mothers or to be incarcerated or a bunch of things that are bad in this weird setting, but that kind of makes sense when you look at it through this life history framework.
Yep. Interesting.
All right. So, last thing I wanted to talk about is you wrote this recent paper on surname diversity using that as a predictor for what was it like novel ideas being people with being exposed to more diversity and using surname diversity as a proxy for that.
So our outcome variable, the thing we wanted to explain was patents per capita at the county level in the United States or breakthrough patents per capita. So that's the patents that seem to be really new and unique rather than just using all the patents. And so we want to do all that per capita. So we think that's a measure of creativity. And we have the patent database going all the way back in. So we have 1940 to 1800 essentially in patents. We have the US Census for about 100 years, 1840, 1850 to 1940. And we combine those two things. And our idea is that most inventions are recombinations of existing ideas or recombinations of ideas. And that the greater the cultural diversity, the more recombination you're going to get. And if you think about culture as being affected by learning from your parents and your local community and uncles and aunts and things like that, that's using surnames as a way of capturing that chunk of diversity. And so for each county, for each decade in US history, we calculated the surname diversity. It's actually an entropy measure. And we use that to then predict patents in the next decade. So the in patents per capita. And what we're able to show is that the more diverse your county is based on these surnames, the more innovations you make per capita. So the more creative your county is. And it doesn't matter whether you use breakthrough or regular patents per capita.
And that's controlling for population size and density and all that.
Yeah. So that's controlling for population size. And then we also do what's called an instrumental variable analysis. That holds just using the regular regression framework. Essentially, it's a correlation. You can add all kinds of controls and things like that. You can even look at the same county over time. So we see if the same county gets more creative when more different surnames arrive, and you can show that. But it's still not a full causal identification. So what we do is we use the inflow of surnames through migration events. They're effectively random with respect to the counties. And so this gives us exogenous shocks to counties over time periods of incoming migrants with different combinations of last names. And so counties get a burst of this, and so they increase their surname diversity. And using that random variation, we're able to show a causal relationship between greater surname diversity and greater creativity as captured by our patent measures.
And then the idea is that surname diversity is a proxy for just diversity of thought and experience.
Yeah. So there's actually two things that are embedded into that measure. So one is what I started with, which is the idea that that ideas are recombinations and that people from different cultural lineages bring together different ideas. So that's part of it. Now, what we've also found, and this comes from my work on kinship, that places that have small, weak nuclear families tend to have high levels of trust in strangers. And it's just here, the simple idea is that if you have lots of relatives, you can use your kin networks and their friends and stuff to figure out who you're going to go to the dentist with and where you're going to get your carpenter and who's going to help you move and things like that. But if you don't have that and you just live in a small family, meaning say lots of surnames as proxied by that, then you end up with higher levels of trust because people are forced in some sense to interact with lots of strangers. And so this gives you higher levels of trust. And what we're able to show is that greater surname diversity is associated with both the kind of things we think are about the information. So for example, occupational diversity you get from greater surname diversity, because there still is a relationship between last name and occupation, and also associated with greater trust, moral universalism, and things like that. So greater surname diversity, more moral universalism, greater trust. And the two things are necessary because if you have lots of different information, but nobody ever interacts, then those ideas never meet each other. They never make baby ideas. And if you have lots of trust, but everybody has exactly the same information in their heads, then there's nothing to share, nothing to recombine. So you need both of these. And so we think they're combined in the surname diversity measure. And then we link that to the patent outcomes.
Do you think in the future, with this Latin text analysis project you mentioned, you'll be able to do something similar, either looking at diversity of maybe the authors in these texts or something like combining it with periods of expansion in the Roman Empire and interacting with new cultures?
Yeah, related to that idea. So the hope is that we can get psychological measures from the Latin text, and then we can see if we can predict that with the spread of the church. So we alluded to this earlier. I think that this branch of Christianity that led to the Catholic Church dismantled the complex kinships of Europe and broke them down into monogamous nuclear families. And this would have created fertile ground for innovation. So I want to be able to test that by looking at this expansion of the church and see if I can link it to psychology as measured in the Latin texts. But we've also gone down the path of linking it to innovation. So I have a separate paper, which is not publicly available yet, which looks at the expansion of the church and uses it to predict patents in Europe in between 1980 and 2014. And what you can show is that small regions within European countries, when only comparing regions within the same country, if they've had a longer dosage of the church based on when the bishoprics arrived, then they produce more patents per capita in the modern world, essentially. And we can also show that's running through the effects on contemporary psychology, things like trust and individualism and whatnot. And the other thing we can do to anchor this in history is from other people, we got this big database of famous people. So this gives us variation in Europe across space and time in the production of creative individuals, people who became known historically for having written something or built something or done something that people consider creative. And we compare that to the production of your generals, your nobles. This is our uncreative category. And so what we show is that after the arrival of the church, you get an uptick in the production of creatives, but you don't get any change in the production of the non-creatives. So that the arrival of the church links to more creative individuals. So we think that's at least some evidence in that direction.
This reminds me of an idea that the scientific revolution in a roundabout way was a result of Christian systematizing thinking, because for hundreds of years, the church is enforcing like this one way of looking at the world. And you have to get really good at rationalizing arguments to fit it into a single framework, which is what the scientific method is doing. And I think Nietzsche argued that in this way, Christianity died at its own hand.
Uh-huh. Well, I definitely think that Christianity died at its own hand. In the weirdest people in the world, I don't know if this fits with that or not. I do argue that science was benefited strongly by analytic thinking, but I think that analytic thinking arose from the psychological changes that were first induced by the breaking down of families into nuclear families. And then you get markets and a few other things that build on top of that. So I guess maybe there's a similarity there with this idea. But then when I look at the emergence of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, you can take British patents in the 18th century. And what you find is that counties with scientific societies where people could get together and swap ideas, similar to the other paper, you get more British patents per capita and you get more exhibits in the World's Fair in 1850. And those counties with those societies where people can get together tend to be of a particular genre of Protestantism. So rather than being the standard English Protestantism, they're the uniformitarianisms. They call them the dissenters. And so they seem to have, and they're like Newton, they're like Newton is their hero and stuff like that. So they seem to think that understanding the world is associated with understanding God. So it's actually a religious motivation driving. So I do
Spinoza.
there's an interesting way in which Catholicism eventually sowed the seeds for the rise of Protestantism, which sowed the seeds for the rise of secularism and science and all that kind
I'm tempted to look at all of that as progress, the influx of new creative ideas and of scientific thinking. Is that still a weird bias?
of. Yes, that is certainly a weird bias. The notion of progress actually emerges sometime after 1500 that people realize that we actually know more than the ancients did. Because for a long time, everything was judged relative to the great sages of the past. And that's true of many societies. And then people began to realize that they didn't even know about the new world, right? They didn't. So people began to realize they knew more than that. And then they recognized that it was possible to know more. There's actually a economist named Anton Howells who argues that it was the spread of an improving mentality that people began to approach problems under the assumption that they could make it better, which apparently wasn't a thing always prior to that.
What does progress look like to you, Joe?
I always recognize that's culturally that's a culturally evolved preference. I'm generally interested in innovation. I think just because I like innovation in my own life, so I like trying to recombine ideas from very different areas. So I guess I like innovation.
That's a place to close. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, good to be with you.